Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. So today's topic is going to be a little bit about populations within an ecosystem, as well as what niches are. And we're also going to talk a little bit about limiting factors. But really what we're going to do today is focus on levels of organization within an ecosystem. So you read the online article about different biomes. And you should know what a biome is because you read about it, right? There are different types. You have forests, you have, the ocean, you have freshwater. There are plenty of them. So within biomes, though, right, because biome is the biggest level of organization, right? It encompasses everything. Within those biomes, there are different levels of organization, starting with habitat that we see here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about what those are. We're going to define them, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what niches are, okay? So let's talk about habitat. Habitat is simply the place in which an organism lives out its life, right? So things like forests, rivers, lakes, grasslands, right? So this is where an organism will live. Very simple. The area in which it lives is its habitat. Okay. Now, as we move on to ecological organization, we're going to see that there is an order of complexity, right? It gets more complex as you move through the ecosystem. So we're, of course, going to start off with species. So species is simply a group of individuals that are genetically related to one another and can breed to produce young. A group of individuals. So a species can be, an example, a group of zebras. That is a species. There are zebras. There may be 20 of them. There may be 50 of them. It doesn't really make a difference. The fact is they are all zebras, and that means they can all live together, work together, mate with one another to produce more zebras, because they are all zebras. We are also a species, humans, right? We cannot mate with any other species. We can only mate within our own species. So a species is just a group of the same individual animal, okay? We then have population. Now, population is a group of organisms belonging to the same species that live in the same area and interact with one another, okay? So this is very similar to a species, but now there are more than just a few, right? So maybe you had a small group of zebras as a species. Now you have hundreds, you have thousands of zebras living with one another. So it's a group of organisms, right? They are a large group. It's not just one single zebra. It's going to be many, 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 many zebras, just a lot of them, okay? You then have a community. Now, a community, we start to see some differentiation. A community is where you have all of the populations of different species that live in the same area and interact with one another. Now, it's also important to remember a community is composed of all of the biotic factors in an area. So community, all the populations of different species. So this could be an example of all the zebras, all the lions, all of the wolves, right? All of the cows. Now, obviously, cows aren't going to be living in the same area as lions, but you get what I'm saying. It's all of the different populations. So you could have 150 lions. You could have a bunch of zebras. You could have thousands of wolves. You could have 1 million different birds. You can have 10,000 different trees, right? They're all in the same area. That is your community. It's a community of living things. So the community is all of your populations, regardless of the species, right? All of them living in one area, including the biotic factors. So these are also things like your trees and your flowers and your plants and all that, okay? Now, once we move through the community, we reach the ecosystem. The ecosystem is going to be all the populations in an area and the non-living aspects of an environment. So the difference between an ecosystem and a community is in the ecosystem, we're also going to consider the abiotic factors, both of them, the biotic and abiotic. Community is only the biotic. Ecosystem is the abiotic and the biotic. So in an ecosystem, you're going to have your zebras, you're going to have your lions, you're going to have your birds, your trees, and now also your water, your soil, your oxygen, your temperature, okay? Everything. So an ecosystem is all of the biotic and abiotic factors within one area. Biosphere, okay? Also, biome, right? Same type of thing. The part of the planet with living organisms. So the biosphere is most of Earth. So the biosphere is our oceans, our atmosphere, our land, right? So the part of our Earth, because you have to realize there's different parts of our Earth's core. You should remember this from when you took Earth science, right? You have the core, you have the mantle, you have the lithosphere, the biosphere, right? And then you get into space and, you're out of Earth's surface. You move on into space. That, of course, does not count here. But the biosphere in particular is the area of Earth where organisms will be alive, okay? So that is the, obviously, land, ocean, air, and even in the soil. Okay? So, what's important to remember is, of course, what these are. So you should be able to identify species, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere. You could be given a picture, right, where it shows you a bunch of organisms, and you should be able to identify what you're looking at. So know how to define it, know how to identify it. And the last thing is understand the order of it. So these little question marks should be arrows. I guess it just got messed up. So it goes from smallest to largest. Species, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere. Species is the smallest because it is only one single organism, like a zebra, whereas biosphere is the largest because that, of course, encompasses every area on Earth where organisms can be found. And it goes from smallest to largest. All right. So, let's define what a niche is. Now, some people say niche, some people say niche, some people say niche. It's all the same, right? Niche is very simply the role and position that a species has in its environment. It's how it meets its needs for food and shelter. It's how it survives, how it reproduces. A species niche includes all of its interactions with the biotic and abiotic factors. So a niche is just, where does this organism fall into in its environment? What type of species is it? What does it do? How does it get food? Does it hunt? Right? Does it scavenge? Does it get nutrition from dead organisms? Right? Where does it live? Does it live in the trees? And if it does live in a tree, does it live high up in a tree? Does it live low in a tree? Does it live in a bush? Does it live on the ground? Does it live in the water? Does it live in the air? Where does it live, right? How does it survive? So we're going to see some examples of that in a second. Realize one thing, though. A niche is determined by the limitations of an organism. These are called limiting factors. We spoke about this a little bit in class. A limiting factor is any biotic or abiotic factor that limits the success of an organism. It limits it. Water, temperature, oxygen amount of carbon dioxide, amount of nitrogen, amount of food, amount of water. All of these things are limiting factors because they will limit the success. If you don't have a lot of food, that limits the success of an organism to live there because there isn't enough food for it to survive. Okay, if you only have a certain amount of oxygen available to breathe, then you could only have a certain number of species survive there because it is limited. Okay? So a couple of examples of limiting factors are, like we said, amount of water, food, temperature, the amount of space. Okay? If you only have room for 100 species, but 150 species move in, 50 of those species are going to die because there isn't enough room. There is limited space due to the limiting factors. Availability of mates. If there are 10,000 male birds, but only 5,000 female birds, the availability of mates has now limited the success of these birds because there are 5,000 more males than females. and they will not be able to mate. So only the first 5,000 will have an opportunity to survive and pass on their genes. The other 5,000 will eventually die. It's a limiting factor, okay? So anything, right? These are just a few examples. There are plenty more. Anything in an ecosystem that could potentially limit is a limiting factor. And most things are. Most things could be considered limiting factors, okay? So we're going to actually stop here, okay? We're going to stop here for a second. And that'll be it for today. All right, we're going to continue with this in class tomorrow, and we'll talk more about niches at that point. All right, guys, have a good night.